Next up, we have Dr. Richard Chow, who is the University Research Manager and Scientist from Intel. He's going to deliver his talk, which you can see on the screen, which is the Decadal Plan for Research in Security and Privacy. Just a little bit about Dr. Richard. Dr. Chow is the University Research Manager and Scientist in the University Research and Collaboration Office within Intel Labs. He guides several of Intel's academic research centers in the areas of security, networking, autonomous systems, and machine learning. In the past, Dr. Chow held positions as research scientist at PARC, research scientist at Samsung Electronics R&D, and security architect at Yahoo and Motorola. His work concentrates on privacy, big data, mobile, and machine learning. He has over 25 granted US patents and over 40 peer-reviewed conference papers, journals, and book chapters. He was awarded runner-up for the 2010 PET Award for Outstanding Research in Privacy-Enhancing Technologies, and he has given invited talks at academic conferences and industry venues such as the RSA Conference, Black Hat, and OWASP. Dr. Chow has a PhD in mathematics from UCLA and a bachelor's in mathematics from the University of Pennsylvania. So without further ado, I welcome you, Dr. Chow, to begin your talk. Thank you. I think you're muted now. I can't hear. Richard, I think you're muted. Oh, can anyone else hear him? Arvind, are you there?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, now you're back.
Better?
Yeah, now you're back. Yep.
Is the volume okay? Sorry.
Volume is great.
Yeah. So thanks, Gilad, for the invitation. Great to have the opportunity to talk to everybody. And I don't know how the system is set up, but if you have any questions in the middle, I'm happy to stop and make it interactive. That might make it more fun for everybody.
Sure. So what would the participants can ask questions in the Q&A button, and any questions at any point, I'll read them out loud to you, basically. So if they pop up, I'll try to find it, and I think it's a question that they want to ask you right then. I'll very gently interrupt and ask the question for you. Is that good?
Yeah. No need to be gentle. You can be
no
rough.
Need to be gentle. Okay. I'll ask the question when it comes.
Okay. Well, so thanks, Gilad, for that introduction. So today, I want to talk about a decadal plan for research in security and privacy. I'll try to explain what that means. So Intel is part of the Semiconductor Research Corporation, SRC. This is a research consortium of most of the major semiconductor companies. And the idea is SRC funds pre-competitive academic research. So these companies pool their funds. So annually, it might be several tens of millions of dollars. I'm not sure exactly how much to fund academic research. So the SRC was formed in the early 80s, and one of the first things it did, which was very successful, was issue this sort of 10-year research plan that served as a roadmap for research priorities for the semiconductor industry. And there have been a couple iterations of that plan since then. And you can go to this URL on this slide for the latest decadal plan. It was released last year. The research described asked for about $3.4 billion of research funding per year. It's a 150-page report, but the SRC has been merciful, right? And they've released an abridged version. I think the abridged version is, 21 pages, and even a one-page executive summary. So you can just go to that site and browse these things if you want. This slide contains a snapshot of the decadal plan participants at one time. This list is ever growing, actually. A lot of the SRC members and also some government agencies are involved in this thing. So the decadal plan effort for the latest decadal plan is about 2 years old. And I'm one of the Intel representatives to the Decadal Plan Committee. So just to give you a little bit more background about this Decadal Plan, there's sort of 5 chapters to it. And I'll just sort of very briefly describe what these chapters are about. The first chapter is about analog electronics. And so something that might be talked about there is smarter physical world machine interfaces. The second chapter is about memory and storage. So it might talk about, memory and storage demands are outstripping silicon supply. So what do you do about that? Third chapter is about communication. So how does communication keep up with data generation rates? Fourth chapter is about energy. And the way things are going, the global energy production, it's not clear whether that's able to support our compute needs in the future, the way our computing is growing and growing. So, and finally, the chapter that we're here to talk about is on security and privacy. And basically this talk is going to be about what we think the research needs in computer and security and privacy will be in the next decade. So, so just to jump right into it, the first thing is cryptography, right? So cryptography, it's really the heart of security, right? And crypto, as you probably all know, takes a really long time for research to become practice. So we're talking on the order of decades, right? And we really need the time to trust an algorithm or to make performance bearable, right? So when a crypto algorithm first appears, people study it for years before, people are comfortable enough to actually use it. So that's why you really need a long time with crypto. So hence, crypto is quite appropriate for a decadal plan in security. And there's sort of a couple sort of areas of crypto that we particularly pointed out. One is post-quantum crypto. So the thing about quantum computers, right? With quantum computing, some of the cryptographic algorithms that we rely on will be breakable, right? Such as, the RSA algorithm. So when people talk about post-quantum crypto, the idea is we want to find, algorithms that are still resilient in this post-quantum world. So that is one, very relevant area of cryptography that we think needs attention. Another area of cryptography that is, quite popular these days is fully homomorphic encryption. So the idea is that fully homomorphic encryption, or FHE, these are algorithms where somebody can do operations on encrypted data and get an encrypted result, and yet not know anything about the original data or result. So you might think about using this in the cloud context. So if you have some private data, you can encrypt it with FHE, upload it to the cloud, and if the cloud is able to operate on the encrypted data and get an encrypted result, then pass that encrypted result back to you. You've basically got the cloud to do computation for you, but they don't know anything about the data that they did it on, right? So you've maintained your privacy. So this is kind of like the holy grail of sort of data outsourcing and security, right?
Can you give us some examples?
You get somebody else to do the computation for you, but they don't know anything about the data that they're operating on. So
Richard,
the thing
can
about,
you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay, great. I was going to ask one question. Can you give us an example of the operations that we would want to do, just to make it a little more real for us? Like, what are the kinds of things that we would want to do that you could even think to do without knowing what the data is? Is it like searching or organizing? What are the kinds of operations we want?
So So all this kinds of the privacy sensitive operations that you sort of would want to do today that you can't do without sort of exposing the data. So for instance, advertising. I mean, advertisements. So in order to get in order for Google or Facebook or a lot of these companies to sort of leverage your sort of browsing data and what you're doing on the web to send you advertisements, they have to sort of know what you're doing, right, on the web. But if they were somehow not able to see how you do that with something like fully homomorphic encryption, so in other words, your data becomes not associated with you, but they're still able to do computations on it and sort of get sort of aggregate trends. So they say, well, people who live in Denver sort of like, this more than people who live in LA. And that's maybe valuable to them from an advertising point of view. But in order to get that kind of information today, they need to know, they need to sort of get it from individuals that they can identify, right? But if you could sort of get you could sort of get this sort of aggregate data without being able to identify anybody, then they're happy because they get sort of the aggregate statistics that they need to do relevant ads, right? And you're happy because your privacy is sort of less compromised. Does that sort of make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can think of any sort of aggregate statistic that is useful, like medical data. You don't want your medical history necessarily revealed to the hospital, but yet the hospital might be doing research that's very useful to a bunch of people. Maybe some part of your history makes you more predisposed to some kind of disease. But in order to figure that out, they have to know a lot about you, right? But if they could do all these kinds of aggregate sort of analysis, sort of anonymously, that would be a plus for everybody, probably. Yeah. So does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. No,
okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. So as I was saying, FHE has been theoretically possible for a while now. I think it was about 2009, 2000. I mean, at least a decade. But only in the past few years has it gone from being completely impractical to something right around the corner, performance-wise. So before it would just take an totally impractical amount of time to do anything with these algorithms. But now there are advances so that they're kind of nearing practicality, and with maybe some hardware support, maybe they will become practical in the very near future. So that is another area that's got a lot of people excited. Another thing that I think deserves a lot of attention is autonomous systems, right? So devices in the physical world, trust becomes a matter of safety. So therefore, security has never been more important, right? So you've probably heard of these GPS spoofing attacks, where you sort of maybe fool a car or a ship or an airplane to think that they're somewhere not exactly where they actually are, because you somehow messed up their GPS signals. And obviously this is not desirable for many reasons. So in an adversarial environment, how do you trust your perception? So if you're like a human, right, you need to sift through all your perceived data and contextual data to evaluate trust, do secure sensor fusion over time. So, you might want to look at your road, and from the physical road, you can sort of work out that, hey, your GPS is not right? Things like this, or maybe the position of the sun or the landmarks. So, but it's a very complicated thing, right, to do all this, to sort of figure out that some particular sensor input is like misbehaving. So at any rate, that's an area I think deserves a lot of attention. But not only attack prevention or detection is important, but recovery is also very important, right? And recovery just means returning to a known good state. And you may want to do recovery pretty quickly. And so there have to be some algorithms to sort of figure out how you recover after you, detect or, after you detect an attack. Another area, that deserves attention, I think, is modern hardware. So we've all heard of these subtle issues in microarchitecture, like these speculative side channels, Spectre and Meltdown a few years ago. So they sort of opened everybody's eyes to the problems in microarchitecture. But there are a lot of other problems in modern hardware. For instance, the supply chain, right? How do you secure the hardware supply chain? Because you're building your hardware from components, not necessarily coming from you, right? Coming from other companies or other places. So how do you know what you're getting? It's very difficult. Another aspect of hardware is, today, SOCs are pretty complicated. Right? You might have a CPU talking to an FPGA and a GPU, right? So these SOCs are tiny distributed systems with distributed security models, different trust assumptions for each component. It's very complex, right? Much more so probably than before. And you can't really talk about hardware without talking about IoT. Low cost, resource constrained devices have been a real problem with security, right? Low cost, so you can't necessarily spend that much money on security, right? Resource constrained, you can't really do crypto that well if you don't have the the processor with all the capability that you need. But yet, we have to make security easier for IoT devices, because security for IoT is incredibly important. And this is not to mention the difficulties that arise from extreme environments, like medical implants, right? So obviously security is a huge issue there, but it's kind of awkward, right? Maybe to have to do an update for a medical implant. And it's not just the hardware becoming more complex. At the macro level, building more complex systems using the hardware is it's becoming more and more common, right? So data centers are more complex, and for good reasons, right? Energy, performance requirements. The common architecture now is, function as a service, right? So an application might be using several different services located on different machines, right? To do its computation. So how do you secure all that? It's not as easy as before. And clouds, clouds now offer trusted execution environments, specialized hardware and software. All these things make everything more complex. And as you all know, complexity is the enemy of security. So we have to figure out ways to sort of manage all this. And in particular, edge computing. Edge computing is growing, right? The center of mass of computation is moving towards the edge. There's a lot of reasons for that. Privacy, latency are a couple of them. But edge computing is just growing by leaps and bounds these days. And trust in edge infrastructure and service providers is a major issue. More complex because of a multi-ownership model, right? Because in the cloud, right? I mean, if you're in a particular data center, it's usually owned by one entity, maybe Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, Amazon, whatever. It's one cloud. But on the edge, you may have a bunch of different parties, right? Maybe a service provider, somebody else owning the hardware, and of course you have the IoT problem, right, at the very edge. So, and finally, something about artificial intelligence. It's the major workload of today, right? It's become computers are doing AI, much of the time, whether we like it or not. But trustworthiness of AI is an open problem. So here, this is perhaps the most famous stop sign in security. This is the one that AI thinks is a 45-mile-per-hour speed limit sign, right? So it's funny how AI can be easily fooled, but AI can fool us just as easily. This deep faked Obama, I cannot tell from the real Obama. So obviously that's a serious, serious problem, right?
Which one's the fake one?
I think it might be the one on the left, but that's the point. You can't really tell. Right? So more problems. Neural networks are black boxes, no explanation for their decisions. We need to make deep learning systems more trusted, transparent, and fair. Right? And just to sort of talk a little bit more about security of AI, you can pretty much attack any part of the machine learning pipeline. During training time, test or inference time, you can even steal the model, right? So lots of bad things can happen to the machine learning pipeline, and all of these things need some research.
Does the machine learning an adversarial landscape, does it have hardware implications? Like, is there any hardware research or anyone thinking about doing hardware research to defend against this or to secure it? Is that even a thing?
Well, hardware might be involved in the performance, right? So for instance, if your machine learning algorithm needs to be adjusted to make it more robust against some of these attacks, then you might want to sort of adjust the hardware to sort of make that run a little more efficiently.
But it's not like there's no current research anyways with like this, because with cryptography you have actual hardware components, right? These trusted enclaves and things like that on the board. But I guess with machine learning AI, it's not there yet. If it's going to get there ever, I don't think it's there yet.
Yeah, you can leverage some of those components. So for instance, you might in an enclave, you might want to put your model. That way it becomes in other words, you can deploy your machine learning model to an enclave with less risk of it being stolen, right, at a client. So if a client is running some sort of enclave, you can sort of deploy it on that enclave, and then the guy who the device owner may not be able to sort of steal the model if it's inside an enclave. And you can also do things like, in an enclave, you may have more trust that the model is faithfully giving you the right inference. And if you don't trust the code that's running, you don't necessarily have that assurance, right? Does that make sense? Or
Yeah.
yeah. So in other words, it's an ingredient that
Yeah.
you can use in your sort of machine learning system to sort of help things out, enclaves. Yeah. Okay. So finally, a big caveat about this. I've sort of talked about what's in the Decadal Plan for security, but do I really believe it? Well, we've talked about lots of areas of research. The nature of security is that it goes hand in hand with every field of computing. So advances in any field basically means more security problems. And this compounds the difficulty of the job of security visionary. So let's pretend we're trying to forecast research areas 10 years ago. So in the year, say 2010, we're trying to forecast the important problems to focus on. And here is a list of the top cited papers from 2019. So if you look at the ones I've circled, these 5, they all have to do with, speculative execution, Spectre meltdown, fallout. And Spectre meltdown, hit us around 2017, right? Now these 4 in brown, deep learning hit it big starting around 2012, right? And about 2014, people started looking at adversarial examples, right? So these 4 have to do with, securing deep learning. And finally, we got 1 on blockchains, right? Smart contracts. So blockchains, started basically in the early 2010s. Bitcoin was invented in 2009, began to get attention in papers written around 2011, 2012. So as you can see, right, you wouldn't have you would have really have been a really good visionary if you could predict these things in 2010, right? So of course, there was research on lots of other important problems, and popularity doesn't necessarily imply importance, right? But the point is, it's a really difficult job, right? To sort of predict what people should do research on in the next 10 years. So nevertheless, right, this Decadal Plan attempts to do that because the SRC needs to fund academics. And this is our best guess as to what research would be most impactful. So thanks, and happy to have some more discussion or questions.
Yeah, we have one question here about supply chain attacks. So question is, supply chain attack, both on hardware and software side, is really coming into the forefront due into an increase of both attacks, essentially. And can you talk about how it's being tackled both in academia and industry?
Well, so we can talk about hardware is kind of maybe more difficult to talk about. But when you talk about software supply chain, I mean, I guess you're probably talking about open source components that people sort of put into their application, but these open source components have problems, right? And
or
so
like SolarWinds, maybe. Like where everyone's using, not even open source, just everyone's using one thing. It's part of their supply, and then that thing gets an exploit, and now everyone's in trouble. Like,
Yeah, I think best practices for that sort of thing, right, are some kind of validation that uh, these these things that you're putting into your application have gone through some kind of security. Um, I don't want to say validation, but that the people are sort of security conscious who are building these things, and there is a lot of uh, guidance out there on how you might discern this, and you can probably I mean, probably easy to find this, but for instance, you can look at the activity in the logs of the committers to that project. And if it hasn't been touched in a long time, for instance, uh, it, it, it may be a little more risky than something that is quite active. And you can also see people, how their response is to security problems that are found. Um, so just by looking at the history of the project and what they how they sort of manage their security, you can sort of get some sort of feeling on how trustworthy a component is. And I know that is not a great answer, but
open source,
there's not a lot
it's
of
when
better
you're
answers
kind of
out
the
there,
best you're going to
unfortunately.
get, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're hiring a company to do something for you, you can probably request that they have audits or only hire companies that are being audited and that have a good security reputation and processes in place and maybe certifications. But when you're using open source tools, I mean, I think what you're saying is kind of, you know, sometimes it's I think sometimes what we tend to do is go with the pack. Well, everyone uses that one, so I'll use that one. And that actually makes it worse when that one gets exploited because then everyone is exploited. But I think it's just
That's
really
true.
hard.
That's true. And you can there are companies that sort of offer a kind of service that they can sort of vet these things for you, right? They can give you sort of
Right.
a whitelist. Um, but you know, there's always going to be problems. Even anything will have problems, right? Eventually. Um, so I don't think there's an easy answer.
Sure. The next question
Yeah.
is about blockchain. Blockchain is an emerging technology. And can you shed any more light on where you think the current research is going to go in blockchain? How will it be used? Um, I think specifically in the security context, but in any context that comes to mind for you.
Uh, so blockchains. Um, Let me see. So how it will be used. So blockchain is like a hammer, right? That people have right now, and they're trying to. People have proposed using it for everything, right?
Lots of things
And
that
how
it
many of
shouldn't be
those
used
things are
for,
actually
basically, right?
suitable?
Yeah,
I mean, or
yeah.
actually make sense for blockchains. It's not entirely clear to me. So I would put myself more in the uh, I
Slightly
mean,
skeptical.
maybe I'm sort of the more conservative on these things, but uh, I remain unconvinced for a lot of these use cases, right?
Okay.
So
Are
some
there
use
any use
cases.
cases that have popped out at you that you really do think this is something where it will be useful?
Um, I think as a public repository of data, I think that use case kind of makes sense. Uh, but it obviously doesn't work for all things, right? Um, so yeah, I'm not really a blockchain expert, but I'm also not really yeah, nothing really comes to mind for me.
Okay. The next question is, with trusted computing and things like TPM, which are being more and more depended on for things like encryption keys, wouldn't any hardware security issues like Spectre, et cetera, have more of an impact? So I think the question is, should we be more worried about things like Spectre because we're using trusted hardware more and more? Is that something you agree with?
So you mean as opposed to before?
I guess, is that an upcoming problem that you perceive that are maybe like it's an over reliance on? I'm not really sure what the question was intended as, but you can interpret it how you like.
Yeah, I think if the question is asking, I mean, hardware security problems are sort of more basic in some sense. It's harder because if the hardware is not secure, then sort of all bets are off, right? But if the software is sort of not secure, then you might have a hope if you can sort of if you're not relying on that software. So for instance, if you have an enclave or a TPM, as the questionnaire mentioned, then you don't necessarily rely on the software to be, not have faults, right? So if you can rely on the TPM, a smaller piece of code, smaller code base, smaller system, then obviously that's better if you can do that. So, but if your hardware has problems, then it seems to me more serious. But I think
that's
luckily,
what the questioner was saying as well.
Yeah, hardware problems are more serious, but it doesn't necessarily follow that Spectre meltdown problems are more serious, right? They're just one hardware problem, right? So we'd have to look at particular hardware issues.
So there was a follow-up to what you're saying, which is that the same questioner said you can patch software to fix security issues, but hardware issues can't be fixed as easily. So I think the thought is that do you think hardware security is more scary than software security, essentially? Because you can patch broken software, but you can't really go and recall everyone's CPU if there's a problem there.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's more expensive. Certainly more expensive. Most of the time, although there are some ways to update, right? Some firmware.
Exactly, yeah.
But generally it's more of a pain, definitely. But some software you can't really update. There's no mechanism to update, and then you're in the same boat, right? So it all depends.
There's a little more general question for you here, which is with the increasing need of secure systems in the world, how important do you think it is to teach cybersecurity students at a young age? So what age do you think we should be learning security? When should we introduce this?
It's hard to introduce security, right, without some sort of knowledge of computers, right, and systems and programming and things like this. And so it would be good to sort of introduce security at the same time. And I don't know what that time is. In the US, it seems to be high school is kind of the time it happens.
As young as we've gotten. And I don't think they're teaching programming in elementary school yet. Maybe a little bit in some schools. No, I wouldn't be surprised if some schools are teaching. They have Scratch. MIT has that Scratch programming language. I'm sure some elementary school kids are learning programming. And if you think about it, young kids today the younger you are, the earlier kids get a smartphone, the more they have to be aware of security to some degree, because, there's problems even with a little kid using a phone. So many bad things can happen. So staying safe for a kid has changed from what it used to be. So
Yeah,
in
getting
that sense,
around
maybe.
parental controls is
Yeah,
definitely teaching them how to do security,
that's true.
right?
Getting
So
around. Oh, I misheard you. You said getting around parental controls. Yeah, teaching them how to hack. Yeah, that's right.
yeah, I mean, it's true. Um, but I mean, Scratch. I don't know how you would sort of introduce security naturally into. I mean, security for me is more of a systems thing, right? It's more of a
Okay.
rather than just sort of a um, programming algorithms thing, which I think when my kids use Scratch, it was more like trying to implement some sort of algorithm, right? Rather than think
Mm.
about breaking a system. But maybe you could sort of
But in the
do
sense
some
that you
sort of
could
Scratch
maybe,
exercise.
yeah, you could say to this, you'd have to show them an exploit basically, and say, look, real computers are just like these algorithms. But if you set it up in a way that you weren't the side effect, somehow there'd have to be some kind of side effect that you could then demonstrate that this is not what you wanted it to do, but it is doing it, and that is how hacks work. Something like that could maybe expose them, I guess. There'd have to be
Yeah,
some kind of side effect in the algorithm, I suppose.
yeah,
Okay, so there's one question about how to learn more about the SRC. I think you had a link up earlier.
yeah.
Can you
Let me see.
cycle back to that, and we can just show the students. So if anyone wants to get the report, they can Google it.
Yeah, I think it's src.org. If you just go to src, I mean, yeah,
There, yeah,
src.org
that's
should,
src.org. Okay.
yeah.
So if anyone's interested in Richard's work or in the SRC and want to know more about the Decadal Plan, this is the link on the screen right now. And I think we're just kind of at time, so I'll just take a moment to thank you so much, Richard, for coming, for taking time out of your busy schedule to present to us. It was very interesting. It's really interesting to see the broad areas that we can all be thinking about for security. And I'm also very grateful that you made the point of showing, well, 10 years ago, could we have predicted what's popular today? And probably not. So it's good to keep an open mind about staying maybe closer to what's happening now. But at the same time, as a university, pursuing research grants, we certainly want to know where the money's being handed out. That's also really important for us. So it's very practical. Thank you very, very much for your time. And
Well,
thank you on
thanks a lot
behalf
for
of
that.
everyone. You're
Yeah,
welcome.
thanks a lot for the invitation. It was a lot of fun.